August 1945. A humid stillness hangs over a former Japanese medical outpost on Luzon, now converted into an Allied-controlled women's POW compound. The war has ended, though the air still carries the tension of a world not yet ready to breathe again. Inside a dim barracks hall, rows of Japanese women, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, some barely out of their teens, sit quietly on wooden benches. Their uniforms are worn, their expressions guarded. They have endured evacuation orders, failed rescues, and sudden surrender. At the front of the room, an Allied officer adjusts a portable film projector. The machine rattles to life, casting a flickering cone of white light across the walls. A screen unfolds, its fabric still creased from storage. None of the women know what they are about to see. The guards offer no explanation. Then the first images appear: American women voting, speaking in public, working in factories, wearing military uniforms. A hush spreads through the room. Eyes widen. Postures shift. For women raised under strict imperial order, where obedience was duty and ambition unspoken, the scenes feel impossible, almost unreal. Yet the film continues, carrying them toward a new understanding the war had never prepared them for. To understand why those images struck with such force, we must step back into the world these women came from, a world shaped long before the Pacific War erupted, and one defined by rigid hierarchy, unquestioned loyalty, and sharply divided gender expectations. In pre-war Japan, women lived under a national ideology built on Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother. It was more than a cultural saying, it was state doctrine. The imperial government promoted a vision of womanhood rooted in obedience, domestic responsibility, and silent endurance. Schools reinforced it. Textbooks reinforced it. The military reinforced it. A woman's purpose, according to state ideology, was to support the nation by raising disciplined children and serving the male-led household. But the pressures of total war slowly pushed women into new spaces. By the late 1930s, Japan needed manpower for expanding battlefields, and thousands of young women were mobilized into support roles. They became nurses, clerks, drivers, telegraph operators, and members of the volunteer corps. Yet even in uniform, they were never equal. They served on the lowest rung of the military hierarchy, expected to show the same loyalty as men, but granted none of the authority. Many of the women who later became POWs were stationed in hospitals scattered across the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Rabaul, and isolated island garrisons. They worked in suffocating tropical heat, often without proper equipment, caring for wounded soldiers who spoke of battles worsening by the week. As Japan's defensive lines collapsed in 1944 and 1945, evacuation orders grew frantic. Some units escaped by submarine or destroyer. Others waited for transports that never came. Many were simply abandoned by retreating officers. Allied landings rolled forward with overwhelming force, overrunning field hospitals and supply depots. Female personnel were captured in groups, sometimes after attempting to surrender, sometimes cornered with no remaining chain of command. For most, it was the first time they had ever spoken directly to a foreigner, let alone a victorious enemy. The shock of surrender, a shame long taught to be worse than death, left many silent and withdrawn. The Allies faced an unusual challenge. Thousands of Japanese POWs, including women, who had been raised to believe surrender was dishonor and the enemy was inhuman. Female POWs were separated from male groups for safety, health, and administrative reasons, and housed in compounds operated by American, Australian, or sometimes British forces. Inside these camps, the conditions were stark but not cruel. The Geneva Convention protections were applied, though Japan itself had never ratified them. Most guards understood that the female POWs had little to do with battlefield atrocities. They were clerks, medics, and auxiliaries caught in the chaos of collapse. But the deeper challenge lay elsewhere. The answer, at least for the Allied psychological units, was simple. The Americans had already used films to re-educate German POWs in Europe. Documentaries exposing concentration camps, newsreels showing democratic institutions, films celebrating civic rights. In the Pacific, a similar approach began, though adapted for cultural and military differences. The Allied command believed that Japan's militarism had been built on controlled information and rigid hierarchy. Breaking that hierarchy required more than lectures. It required contrast. It required images that challenged assumptions. It required showing what Japan had told its people did not exist. Among the many subjects chosen for POW screenings, women's equality was one of the most strategically important. The Allied occupation authorities and later SCAP in Japan proper believed that empowering women, politically and socially, would help stabilize the new post-war order. 4 Japanese women POWs. However, the concept was unimaginable. They had never voted, never debated political issues openly, never imagined themselves capable of military rank or public authority. Their entire lives had unfolded under a system where men led and women followed. Thus, when Allied officers prepared a simple film screening in a tropical barracks hall, they were not just showing entertainment. They were preparing a confrontation between what these women believed the world was and what it actually could be. These screenings would become a defining moment in the broader re-education effort, revealing not only the depth of wartime indoctrination, but also the quiet curiosity hidden beneath it. And to understand why the reactions were so powerful, we must look more closely at the strategic goals behind these films and how the broader occupation envisioned Japan's transformation. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the guns fell silent, but a far larger struggle began. The struggle to reshape an entire nation's worldview. This responsibility fell to the Allied occupation forces, led by the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, General Douglas MacArthur, whose headquarters in Tokyo quickly became the center of one of the most ambitious social transformations of the 20th century. For the Allies, Japan's defeat was not merely military. It was ideological. They believed the pre-war government had engineered a society built on conformity, ultranationalism, and rigid obedience. Reversing that system meant introducing ideas that many Japanese had never encountered: individual rights, rule of law, democratic institutions, and crucially, gender equality. And this was not a minor side project. It was a cornerstone of the occupation. In 1945 to 46, SCAP's Civil Information and Education Section launched a massive campaign to remake Japan's information landscape. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, textbooks, and public lectures were redesigned to promote democratic values. Among their most important tools were films, dozens of short documentaries, newsreels, and educational pieces imported from the United States and Britain or produced locally under Allied supervision. Titles included pieces on civic participation, labor rights, family health, elections, and in several cases, the role of women in democratic societies. These films were not tailored specifically for POWs. They were intended for use across occupied Japan, from schools to community halls. But POW compounds, especially those housing female detainees, became early testing grounds for their effectiveness. For the Japanese women now living behind barbed wire in former Allied field camps, these screenings introduced ideas they had never been permitted to witness. In Japan, the government had long controlled the flow of foreign cultural material. Hollywood films disappeared from cinemas in the late 1930s. Western magazines became restricted, and any discussion of women's political rights was firmly suppressed. Thus, when these women saw images of American and British women standing in voting lines, driving ambulances, working as factory supervisors, or addressing public meetings, the reaction was visceral. Many had simply never seen a woman speak publicly with that level of confidence. To Allied instructors and interpreters, the reactions were revealing. Some women remained rigid, their expressions stiff with disbelief. Others whispered to one another in surprise, asking if such things were truly allowed. A few even looked uneasy, as though witnessing something inappropriate or disorienting. Not because the content was offensive, but because it contradicted everything they had been taught about social order. Behind these reactions lay a deep contrast between two wartime systems. In Imperial Japan, obedience and sacrifice were virtues. In the United States and Britain, wartime mobilization had expanded women's responsibilities dramatically. The Allied war effort had placed women in factories, laboratories, communication centers, and auxiliary military units. Japanese propaganda had dismissed these developments as signs of Western decay, yet here they were, presented plainly and confidently on film. Inside the POW camps, the screenings played an additional role. They were a way to foster trust, reduce hostility, and introduce foreign concepts without confrontation. American psychologists involved in POW oversight had learned during earlier European operations that films were often more effective than lectures. They bypassed linguistic barriers. They bypassed defensiveness. They showed the world as it was, or at least as the Allies wanted the rebuilding world to become. For female POWs, the impact was amplified by isolation. Many had been stationed on remote islands for years. Their exposure to international life had been minimal even before the war. The films were not simply propaganda. They were windows into a reality that felt almost impossible. As these women watched, they were not merely seeing foreign societies. They were seeing potential futures. Futures in which women possessed rights, agency, and voice. Concepts that would soon become central to post-war Japanese reform. And as the occupation deepened, similar screenings spread across Japan itself, from Hiroshima to Hokkaido, reaching civilians who had lived under wartime censorship. The POW screenings, early and controlled, offered a clear measure of how deeply imperial ideology had shaped perceptions and how powerful visual media could be in reshaping them. Within these camp walls, the women's quiet astonishment revealed more than cultural difference. It revealed the starting point from which Japan's entire post-war transformation would begin. Next, we examine these developments through multiple angles: human, ideological, psychological, and strategic, to understand the layers of emotion and complexity behind this remarkable moment. For the women seated in that dim barracks hall, the shock was not theatrical. It was deeply personal. Most had grown up in rural prefectures where the rhythms of life were rigid and predictable. Chores before school, silent deference at the dinner table, teachers who emphasized virtue over curiosity. Even those from cities like Osaka or Yokohama had been raised within the same cultural boundaries. A woman could be educated, but only to serve. She could work, but only in roles aligned with nurturing or obedience. Thus, when the first film montage showed American women in factory overalls, welding torches in hand, their reactions were immediate and instinctive. Some leaned forward unconsciously. Others blinked in disbelief. A few lowered their gaze, unsure whether they should be watching such scenes at all. But the moment that etched itself into memory came when the film cut to an American polling station in 1944. Women, young, old, middle class, working class, stepped confidently into voting booths. Many Japanese POWs had never even heard their mothers speak about political issues. Now they saw foreign women placing ballots into boxes as a matter of ordinary civic duty. To the Allied observers, the expressions told the story: widened eyes, compressed lips, a subtle intake of breath. It was the dawning realization that the world outside Japan operated under rules they had never imagined. The shock was not rooted in envy or resentment. It was rooted in absolute unfamiliarity, the recognition that they had been kept from witnessing the full range of what women elsewhere could become. Their silence in that moment was not emptiness. It was processing, the first step toward questioning. And that quiet human reaction opened a doorway to a far deeper ideological conflict. The Imperial Japanese state had spent decades crafting a worldview in which equality, whether political or gender-based, was portrayed as a foreign weakness. Leaders insisted that Japan's strength came from unity, hierarchy, and unquestioned loyalty. Every citizen had a role, and every role was justified by tradition. Men were warriors, women were caretakers. The emperor was divine, and dissent, even in thought, was dangerous. This was not passive conditioning. It was a deliberate system. Schools distributed moral education textbooks that praised sacrifice and criticized Western liberalism. Newspapers, tightly censored, rarely mentioned foreign reforms. When American women gained expanded wartime responsibilities, Japanese state media dismissed it as evidence of collapsing family structures in the West, a sign of moral decay. Thus, when POWs saw these same Western women proudly serving as officers in the Women's Army Corps or running major industrial lines, their minds faced a collision between ideology and evidence. It was one thing to hear wartime propaganda describe foreign societies. It was another to see foreign women acting with confidence, respect, and authority. Many Japanese female POWs had internalized the belief that obedience was not merely expected, it was righteous. Watching women who acted independently felt almost transgressive. It challenged the moral foundation they had been raised upon. For some, the contradiction created discomfort. For others, a stirring curiosity. And for a few, it awakened the quiet question, what else had we never been allowed to see? These ideological fractures did not emerge loudly. They emerged in glances, whispered questions, and thoughtful silence long after the projector stopped. The films did not simply show democracy. They confronted indoctrination. And the women, processing confusion and fascination, found themselves at the center of an ideological crossroads. Their reactions brought new attention from camp officials, who saw an opportunity to deepen understanding through social engagement. But inside the compounds themselves, another dynamic shaped the experience, the everyday interactions that surrounded these screenings. The screenings were not isolated events. They unfolded within a complex social environment. Female POW camps functioned differently from male ones. The atmosphere was quieter, more orderly, and at times surprisingly collaborative. Guards recognized that these women had not been frontline soldiers. Many were trained professionals, nurses accustomed to discipline and clerks skilled in organization. Daily routines revolved around simple tasks: cleaning, scheduled meals, medical checks, and occasional interviews with allied personnel. Language barriers were present, but less severe than expected. Some women knew basic English from pre-war schooling. Others learned quickly through necessity. Interpreters bridged the rest. This environment shaped how the screenings were perceived. Guards often noticed the women discussing the films afterward, cautiously at first, then with increasing openness. Not debates, but hesitant exchanges. Are women truly allowed to speak in assemblies? Do they work even after marriage? Do men not object? These conversations revealed layers of both curiosity and apprehension. The women feared appearing too interested, unsure how their peers or guards might interpret enthusiasm. Allied personnel, aware of cultural sensitivity, avoided pushing opinions. They allowed the films to speak for themselves. What made these screenings effective was precisely this neutrality. The women did not feel pressure to react. They were given space to think, something wartime Japan had rarely granted them. And within that space, the seeds of reflection took root. The POW camps, though temporary, became incubators of a subtle, yet profound psychological shift. One that would soon reach its peak during a pivotal screening that would be remembered long after the war ended. For years, Imperial Japan had shaped not only behavior, but inner thought. From childhood onward, young women were taught to suppress doubt, avoid independent political thinking, and accept without question the social hierarchy into which they were born. Propaganda was not simply external. It was internalized through repetition, ritual, and fear of bringing shame upon one's family. But in the POW compounds, the psychological armor that had held firm throughout the war began to fracture. Not through coercion or forced re-education, but through quiet contrast, the steady realization that much of what they had believed about the outside world was incomplete or inaccurate. The films acted as catalysts. When a reel showed British women serving as members of parliament, the reaction was not uniform disbelief. It was a subtle mixture of awe, confusion, and something bordering on admiration. For a Japanese woman in 1945, public political voice had been unimaginable, a world where even expressing an opinion on state matters was improper, let alone participating. These internal conflicts unfolded silently. Guards noted that many women became introspective after screenings, sitting alone on the edges of the compound or writing quietly in notebooks provided by the camp. A few asked to see the films again, not for entertainment, but because their minds struggled to reconcile conflicting truths. Psychologists later described the process as cognitive release, the beginning of accepting that their worldview had been shaped, filtered, and limited. The films did not shame them. They illuminated possibilities. And with each screening, the distance between the Japan they had known and the world they were witnessing grew wider. This psychological tension would eventually prepare them for the most decisive element of the re-education program, contrasting wartime indoctrination with lived experience. To the Allied occupation authorities, gender equality was not simply a moral principle. It was a strategic tool. The goal was to reshape post-war Japan into a stable, democratic partner, one less likely to return to militarism or authoritarian control. Women were seen as key to that transformation. SCAP officials believed that empowering women politically and socially would dilute old power structures and help rebuild civic society from the ground up. In 1946, this thinking would lead to landmark reforms, granting women the right to vote, allowing them to run for office, encouraging their participation in labor unions, and rewriting the legal foundations of family life. But in 1945, when the women POWs were watching those early films, none of this had happened yet. What they were seeing was a preview, a glimpse of the direction Japan would soon be pushed toward. The films served a dual purpose: to expose POWs and eventually civilians to democratic norms, and to break the myth that Allied societies were decadent, chaotic, or morally weak. Showing American and British women in professional roles was meant to demonstrate that democratic societies could be strong precisely because they drew on the abilities of all citizens, not just men. For Allied planners, these screenings were a low-risk, high-impact method of introducing unfamiliar concepts. No confrontation, no lectures, just observation. The women's genuine curiosity proved that the method was working, and the POW camps became early indicators of how Japanese society might respond to broader reforms once occupation policies spread across the main islands. The Allies did not expect immediate change. They understood the weight of cultural history, but they recognized something important. Exposure leads to questioning, and questioning leads to openness. This was the strategic foundation upon which the screenings rested, and the women's reactions confirmed that psychological change was already beginning. Perhaps the most significant angle was the cultural dissonance that followed the screenings. For these women, the war had been the defining event of their youth. They had served loyally, endured hardship, and believed deeply in the moral righteousness of their nation's cause. Surrender had already brought emotional shock and uncertainty. Now, the films introduced an additional layer: the sense that their personal identity, shaped by years of national ideology, was unstable. Some women reacted defensively, insisting that Western behavior lacked modesty or discipline. They returned to familiar cultural anchors, emphasizing values of humility and harmony. These responses were not resistance. They were coping mechanisms. Others, however, found themselves quietly inspired. The idea that women could work openly in public roles without losing respect felt radical. A few camp nurses asked Allied personnel about medical schools abroad. Clerks asked how long American women typically worked before marriage. These questions reflected a deeper longing, the desire to imagine a self not defined solely by traditional duty. Yet this exploration came with guilt. Many POWs felt disloyal simply for being curious. They worried how their families back home would react, and whether admiring foreign practices meant abandoning their own culture. This internal conflict, admiration mixed with guilt, echoed across the compound. It revealed how deeply wartime ideology had shaped their understanding of womanhood. But it also revealed something else. The screenings had not converted them. They had opened a door. And as the war-torn world around them began to shift, these women found themselves standing at the threshold of a future they had never expected to witness. The moment preparing to unfold. The moment when one particular film would break through the last remaining barrier, would become the true turning point of their captivity and their worldview. The winter sky hangs low over the Eastern Front, a dull sheet of iron pressed against a landscape already broken by months of retreat. The German columns move in silence now. No music, no shouted orders, only the steady crunch of boots through frozen mud. What once was an army advancing with confidence is now a scattered mass of exhausted men and women, trying to escape a war that has turned against them with unrelenting force. Among them march the female auxiliaries, the Helferinnen, the radio operators, clerks, medics, drivers, women who have been told they would never see the front, yet now find themselves face to face with its collapse. Frost gathers on their scarves. Their gloves are thin. Many carry nothing but a small field pack and the weight of a war that no longer makes sense. Up ahead, artillery flashes on the horizon. Soviet units are closing in. A Luftwaffe signals detachment halts near a ruined farmhouse. Its roof partially collapsed, smoke still rising from beams that froze mid-burn. Inside, a few women huddle near a broken stove, trying to warm their hands. They speak in short, tired whispers, not about ideology, not about victory, but about the basics: hunger, cold, family. One taps the frost from a field radio, knowing it won't work. The batteries froze during the night. Outside, the sound of an engine struggles into the wind. A staff car crawls toward them, tires slipping on ice, fenders dented from a previous skirmish. A Wehrmacht officer steps out, his greatcoat stiff with frost. He scans the group, not with anger, but with a kind of stunned resignation. "Get ready to move," he says quietly. "We have one chance to break through before the Soviets surround the road." No one argues. No one feels brave. But everyone stands. The march resumes. Along the roadside lie the burned-out shapes of German half-tracks and Soviet T-34s, their steel hulks rising like frozen tombstones in the snow. The women stare as they pass, reminders that whatever is waiting ahead cannot be worse than what lies behind. Then, in the distance, a rumble. Not thunder. Tanks. A Soviet advance guard is pushing toward the village ahead. The officer orders the column into the tree lane. The women scatter between the pines, their breath forming sharp clouds in the cold. Branches crack under boots. Somewhere behind them, machine gun fire snaps through the air, stitching across the open fields. A medic, a young woman from Hamburg who once dreamed of studying medicine, slips as she moves for cover, falling to her knees in the snow. Another Helferin grabs her arm, pulling her behind a tree just as a Soviet shell detonates on the road they had been walking minutes earlier. The shock wave rolls through the forest. Snow falls like shattered glass. For a moment, everything is silent. But the war is still moving. and the front is collapsing faster than anyone imagined. Ahead lies a crossroads, a final decision point for thousands of retreating German units. Take the wrong road, and they will be cut off entirely. Take the right one, and they may reach the next town, regroup, and survive another day. It is here, at this fractured intersection of fear and desperation, that the fate of the female auxiliaries begins to narrow. The march, the cold, the Soviet advance. All of it is funneling them toward a moment none of them trained for. Capture. And as they approach the crossroads, the first Soviet scouts appear through the snowfall. The climax begins in earnest. The first Soviet scouts emerge like shadows through the drifting snow, silhouettes carrying rifles, moving slowly, methodically, as if the cold itself has taught them patience. They don't shout. They don't signal. They advance with the calm certainty of an army that knows the collapse of its enemy is only a matter of time. The German column freezes. For a heartbeat, no one moves, not the women, not the officer, not even the medics helping their wounded. Only the wind continues, threading between the trees like a thin, icy whisper. Then the officer lowers his binoculars. There is no panic in his face, only the dull acceptance of a man who has measured the distance, counted the rifles, and realized that any attempt to fight would be a death sentence. He gestures with one gloved hand. Back, into the woods. Quietly, the column turns, but the forest is no longer a haven. Soviet flanking units are moving faster than expected. Distant engines echo through the pines, trucks, perhaps armored cars. A circle is tightening around them, one branch of the Red Army folding into the next. The women quicken their pace, breath turning into ragged frost. Many have been marching for days with almost no food. Their boots are soaked, their hands numb. Even the strongest now struggle to keep up as the forest grows denser and the snow deeper. One of the drivers, an older woman in her late 30s, her face lined from weeks of exhaustion, stops to help a younger auxiliary whose legs are giving out. She hoists the girl's arm over her shoulder, refusing to leave her behind. Survival is no longer an individual effort. It is a shared burden. Behind them, gunfire cracks. Short bursts. A Soviet patrol has spotted their rear guard. The officer hisses, "Move." Branches whip against coats. Snow kicks up under boots. The forest feels alive with danger, every sound amplified by fear. A fallen tree blocks the path. The women scramble over it, some slipping, some crawling, some pulled up by others who refuse to let the line break. Another burst of gunfire. Closer. The women duck instinctively, but there is nowhere to hide. The forest is thinning ahead, the end of the tree line approaching. Through the trees, they see it. A broad, open field. Cold, empty, exposed. If they cross it, they might reach the next village. If they stay in the forest, they will be overtaken. The officer hesitates only a moment before making the choice that will seal their fate. We run. The first group breaks from the trees, boots sinking into powdery snow. Their dark coats stand out starkly against the white field. It takes only seconds for the Soviets to spot the movement. A machine gun opens up from the opposite tree line. Snow erupts in sharp, violent bursts around the fleeing column. Horrified screams mix with the thunder of the weapon. The women throw themselves to the ground, instinct taking over as bullets carve lines across the field. Some crawl, some freeze, some pray. The officer shouts for the machine gunner to hold fire, but there is no machine gunner. The German heavy weapons were abandoned days ago. He shouts anyway, as if sheer force of will could conjure a defense from the frozen earth. Another burst. Closer. Lower. A nurse cries out as a bullet clips her pack, tearing it open in a spray of fabric and snow. Another woman grabs her, dragging her toward a shallow depression in the ground. The two collapse together, gasping, trembling, listening as the Soviet gun rakes the field in long, merciless sweeps. Then, suddenly, the firing stops. Not because they escaped, but because a new Soviet voice begins shouting orders. The tone is sharp, commanding, final. The women look up. Across the snowy field, Soviet infantry begins stepping out from the tree line in a long, deliberate line. Rifles raised, spread evenly, advancing without haste. They're not attacking. They're taking prisoners. The German officer lowers his head. He knows what this means. He knows what comes next. And as the Soviet soldiers move forward, spreading out to encircle the surviving auxiliaries, a cold realization settles over the women as clearly as the snow around them. Their war is no longer one of marching or retreating. It is now a war of survival under capture. The moment the circle tightened and the rifles leveled, the German women knew the retreat was over. What followed was not chaos, but a cold, methodical process, one the Red Army had repeated countless times as it pushed westward through collapsing German lines. The Soviet commander stepped forward first, his expression unreadable beneath a thick fur hat dusted with frost. He surveyed the group. Exhausted auxiliaries, medics smeared with mud and blood, drivers trembling from cold and shock. Most had no weapons. A few dropped small sidearms into the snow without being asked. The officer in charge raised his hands slowly, the gesture as automatic as breathing. Within minutes, the field became a tableau of surrender. Rifles pointed downward, prisoners moving in silent rows, guards spreading out with the practiced rhythm of men who had done this at every village, every river crossing, every broken road since the start of the offensive. The women were moved first into the tree line for shelter from the wind. There, Soviet soldiers searched them with strict but not violent efficiency, checking pockets for concealed weapons, removing knives, sometimes confiscating personal items without comment. Fear remained constant in the air, but it was a practical fear shaped more by uncertainty than immediate danger. Even in that moment, many sensed they were entering an unknown world governed by rules they did not understand. As the column began marching toward the collection point, the psychological shift set in. Just hours earlier, they had been fleeing, clinging to their last scrap of autonomy. Now every step was determined by another army, another language, another fate. Some walked in stunned silence, staring straight ahead. Others whispered frantic prayers. A nurse from Hamburg kept looking back at the field where the gunfire had erupted, as if expecting someone she knew to rise from the snow. The Soviets marched them to a farmhouse that had been converted into a temporary holding station. Here, the atmosphere changed again. A medical orderly, a woman barely older than the prisoners, inspected frostbite injuries and treated them without ceremony. A Soviet sergeant handed out a bucket of thin millet porridge. It was the first warm food many of the women had eaten in days. The contrast between fear and relief created a strange emotional confusion. Humiliation intertwined with gratitude, dread merging with exhaustion. As night fell, the prisoners were herded into a barn. The floor was cold, but it was dry, and the roof shielded them from the wind. The women huddled together under blankets they had carried since their evacuation from East Prussia. In the shadows, some cried softly, letting the fear they had suppressed finally surface. Others stared at the wooden beams above, thinking not of their capture, but of home, towns that had already been overrun, families they might never see again. By morning, the routine shifted again. Soviet trucks arrived to transport the first group of captives east. Their destination was unclear. Rumors spread quickly. A POW camp in Lithuania, a labor site near Minsk, a transit center deeper inside Russia. No one knew which rumor to believe. The women were divided into smaller groups, by rank, by health, sometimes simply by the order they were standing in. Those selected to leave immediately climbed into the back of the trucks, guided by guards, but not beaten or dragged. As the engines thundered to life, the women left behind watched the trucks fade into the snowy road. For them, the waiting had begun, The long, suffocating wait for their own transport, their own unknown journey. Inside the barn, the remaining women whispered to each other, trading scraps of information. Stories of earlier columns captured along the Baltic coast, rumors of camps with strict regimens but predictable meals, and darker rumors of forced labor battalions sent to rebuild war-torn cities. Each rumor carried a different tone, some hopeful, some grim, but all shared one truth. Their lives were no longer their own, and as they lay on the cold wooden floor that second night, it became clear that the surrender in the snowy field had only been the beginning. The real transformation, the psychological unraveling and rebuilding that captivity would impose, was still ahead of them. This realization spread slowly, settling over the group like the frost creeping along the barn walls, shaping their first full day as prisoners and setting the stage for everything that would come next. The days that followed moved with a mechanical rhythm, each hour blending into the next, as the women were gradually absorbed into the vast Soviet POW system that stretched across newly liberated territory. With every checkpoint, every transfer, every night spent in a different barn or schoolhouse or abandoned shed, the scale of their new reality became clearer. They were now a tiny fragment of a much larger human tide, tens of thousands of captured Germans being processed, sorted, and sent east. The first major transit point was in Kaunas, a city scarred by months of fighting. The women arrived on foot, escorted by a pair of guards who remained alert but not hostile. The streets were lined with burned-out German trucks, shattered windows, and buildings blackened by artillery. Civilians passed them silently, some watching with bitterness, others with a numb kind of detachment that only war could produce. Inside the commandeered school building that served as the POW registry, the process became more formal. Tables were lined up in rows. Soviet clerks, bundled in heavy wool coats, recorded names, ranks, and hometowns in thick ledgers. Translators, many of them Lithuanian or Russian women, moved between the desks, interpreting answers spoken in trembling German. For the first time since their capture, the women felt themselves becoming individuals again. Their identities were no longer blurs in a retreating column. They were now entries in Soviet documents, subjects in a system that demanded order even amid chaos. Medical inspections followed. A Soviet doctor, weary from days of continuous work, examined frostbite, infections, and trench foot. Those with severe conditions were diverted to a makeshift infirmary downstairs. A young auxiliary with badly swollen hands cried as the doctor bandaged her fingers. The treatment was rough, but it was treatment nonetheless. After processing, the women were marched to a rail yard on the city's outskirts. Rows of boxcars stood waiting, some with hay spread across the floors, others bare. The sight alone stirred panic. Stories had circulated among German troops about brutal transport conditions, and even though the guards did not shout or push them, the fear of the unknown closed in tight. When the doors slid shut, darkness filled the car. Only a small vent near the roof allowed in thin, frigid air. The clatter of metal bolts locked them inside, signaling the beginning of a journey none could predict or control. Hours turned into days. Whenever the train stopped, guards opened the doors briefly to distribute buckets of porridge, to collect the metal pails used as toilets, or to allow the women a few minutes to stretch their legs under supervision. The landscape beyond the tracks changed slowly, from the Baltic forest to the flat, windswept plains deeper inside Soviet territory. Some days, the train didn't move at all. Weather, damaged tracks, or traffic delays often turned the journey into long stretches of stillness. In those moments, the women spoke quietly among themselves, sharing stories of home or memories of pre-war normalcy. One nurse described her small apartment in Leipzig. Another recalled her training days in the Red Cross. A former driver talked about her childhood on a Bavarian farm. These conversations weren't just distractions. They were a way to anchor themselves, to avoid drifting into despair. Eventually, the train reached a larger camp complex somewhere near Smolensk. Wooden guard towers rose above long rows of barracks. Barbed wire surrounded the perimeter. The sight caused a wave of silent dread, but the reception was more organized than expected. The women were separated into smaller groups again. Some were assigned to barracks reserved for medical staff. Others were placed with general POW labor units. A few were sent directly to camp kitchens, their experience handling supplies making them valuable for daily operations. Inside the barracks, life settled into a predictable routine. Wake-up calls at dawn. Roll call in the yard. Distribution of bread rations. Work assignments ranging from laundry to snow clearing to sorting equipment recovered from former battlefields. The conditions were harsh, but the structure provided a small sense of stability. Reports from other camps filtered in, carried through whispered conversations, or encoded in letters inspected by censors. Some labor detachments were being moved further east toward construction projects near Moscow or Kaluga. Others were assigned to agricultural collectives, where women worked alongside local civilians rebuilding farms devastated by the war. The scale of their captivity, its duration, its demands, its constant uncertainty, became clearer each week. For some, this realization deepened despair. For others, it ignited a quiet determination to endure. But regardless of how each woman processed her new reality, they all felt the same unspoken truth. The moment of their capture had fractured their old identities. Whatever they had been before, drivers, medics, auxiliaries, officers, clerks, was now overshadowed by their collective status as prisoners of war. And as winter slowly loosened its grip, replaced by the muddy thaw of early spring, the women understood that the war outside was nearing its end. But their own ordeal had only reached its middle chapter. A new phase was approaching, one that would test not their physical endurance, but their beliefs, their assumptions, and the world they thought they understood. In the quiet months that followed their capture, as the war drew to its final, brutal end, the German women found themselves living between two worlds. The world they had been raised in, shaped by duty, hierarchy, and obedience, and a world they now witnessed inside Soviet captivity, where hardship mingled unexpectedly with glimpses of unfamiliar ideas. Among the most striking experiences for many was the exposure to a different social narrative, one that challenged the strict cultural assumptions they had carried through the war. In some camps, Soviet political officers organized screenings of short instructional films meant to explain the principles of equality and collective effort that underpin the state. The women watched in silence as the projector clattered, casting images of workers, soldiers, and families on the makeshift screen. These were simple films designed for broad propaganda use. Yet to prisoners who had grown up under rigidly controlled German ideology, they revealed a world whose values contrasted sharply with their own. Some reacted with skepticism, others with quiet curiosity. But whether embraced or dismissed, the film served as a mirror, one that forced them to confront the collapse of the worldview they had carried through the war. The defeat of their army had already shaken their sense of purpose. Captivity reshaped the rest. In the long evenings, sitting on wooden bunks or huddling near iron stoves, they discussed what they had seen. Not defiantly, but cautiously, as if unsure of how to process an idea that did not fit neatly into the world they once knew. By the time repatriation began months or years later, the war they had participated in felt distant, almost unreal. They returned to a Germany that no longer resembled the nation they had left behind. Cities in ruins, families scattered, and an entire society undergoing reconstruction under Allied oversight. Yet the lessons of captivity stayed with them. Hardship had taught resilience. Exposure to other ideologies had broadened their sense of the world. The collapse of rigid certainties had created space for quieter, more personal forms of reflection. History often remembers great battles, decisive offensives, and the leaders who commanded them. But in the shadows of those sweeping events stood individuals whose experiences formed the human fabric of the war, people who marched, surrendered, endured, and learned. The women captured in the snow, that winter became part of that fabric. Their journey through fear, captivity, and unexpected encounters with new ideas remains a reminder that war does not end with surrender. It continues in the minds of those who must live with what follows.